I've had all the parts that I needed in order to complete the Brembo brake swap onto my truck. The only thing that I've been waiting on for a long time was to find a machinist who could machine the rotors so that they would fit the Tacoma hubs. I found somebody recently and I was able to get that done, so now I finally have everything I need in order to get this installation completed. So on the lower right hand corner I have gyro disc 2-piece rotors. These were intended for a Mitsubishi Lancer Evo 8 or 9. The swap is usually done using the standard cast iron rotors without the aluminum centers, but because at the time I wanted to go ahead and do a baller track ready version, I went ahead and spent the coin and got those gyro disc rotors. Also made it a little bit easier for the machinist to do the modifications in order to fit the Tacoma. I got myself CTSV calipers. I'd originally ordered ATS calipers, but when I ordered them, I got one ATS and one CTSV caliper in the boxes by mistake. So then what I did was I ordered one ATS and one CTSV because I noticed that the mounting holes seemed to be in the same exact positions, which meant that these would definitely work, or so it seemed. And so I had the ATS and the CTSV calipers and figured if the CTSV bolts on the same way as the ATS, then I'd be happy with that. Because these actually have the wraparound line for the brake fluid, so they're a little bit more motorsport oriented than the ATS Brembos are. They have an internal recirculation line. I also got myself a set of stainless brake lines from Stoptech. These are actually meant for an Impreza STI. They actually also make them for the Toyota Tacoma, and they would be the right thread to attach to these calipers, but at the time that this kit was developed by Mike, that's the length that we sized out that we needed based on the big brake kit that I did on my truck in the past using the Willwoods. So I've gone ahead and kept that same theme going. I feel like the Tacoma ones might be a little bit shorter, so it's probably better to have a longer brake line than to have a shorter one, right? You don't want to lose a line on droop or something. But in any case, this is everything that I need. I'm going to head downstairs and start doing that in a few, but first let me explain how the rotors work. So if you've never done brakes on a first generation Tacoma, and I can't speak to the second and third generation trucks because I'm not as familiar with those, but on the first gen at least, instead of your rotor being a standard floating rotor, right, that sits on the hub and the lug nuts come out of these 5 holes, so basically just slide on rotor, what you have instead is that the rotor slides in from the back of the hub and bolts to the hub. So the hub that has the lug nuts that your wheel holds onto, right, and that has your wheel bearings inside of it, spins on your spindle, etc., it's not going to be behind the rotor, but rather in front of it. The rotor is going to slip in from the back, and it's going to bolt to it via 5 holes, which are these holes that I've had drilled here, drilled and tapped, right? It uses an M10 by 1.25 thread, if I'm not mistaken, and that is how the rotor holds onto the back of the hub. The problem with that, of course, is when you buy a rotor from a regular car like a Mitsubishi Lancer Evo, the Evo actually has the same lug pattern and hub bore as the Toyota Tacoma, so you can use Evo wheels or Evo sized wheels on the Tacoma and they will fit perfectly. But in the case of the Evo, it's a standard slide on or, floating rotor setup where the rotor is just dropped onto the hub, through the lug nuts and then pushed, the caliper holds it on, plus the wheels are pushing down on it when they're installed. So that means that when you get these, you don't have the holes needed to bolt them to the hub of the Tacoma, and this opening here will be too small to let the hub slide through. So your machinist is going to have to mount this on a lathe and turn this right out to the width necessary for your hub to slide through. So ideally you would take the machinist a hub with the studs on it and at least one of the bolts for holding it, just so that he can have that for reference and he can test it out once he's drilled these holes and tapped them. But if you have that, you give it to the machinist. I mean, you could take it off your truck and just leave your truck up on a jack stand. I don't like that method because there's a high likelihood you'll get crud or rust building up on your spindle unless you leave it inside a garage. So I'm not very keen on that methodology. I do, however, like the methodology of just ordering another hub, and annoyingly enough, like, you can buy a hub for a 4-wheel drive Tacoma for peanuts on eBay, or even at the auto parts, they'll sell them brand new. You want a hub for the 2-wheel drive trucks, it's extremely rare and expensive. I was only able to find them used on eBay for $100. A local junkyard actually had a Tacoma that I could take it off, and the guy wanted $100 for the entire, I had to take like the entire spindle with it, which wouldn't have been a bad deal, but then I would have had a spindle that I don't need or want, taking up space in my house. And on top of that, those junkyards suck. You have to wait for somebody to pull stuff for you, and the guy who was supposed to pull the part wouldn't give me the time of day. So I said, to heck with this place. I rode out of there, came back home, ordered this on eBay, $99, so just under the 100. I only got a hub, but whatever, I got what I needed. So basically that's what you need to do in order to make this work. The first part of this install is to remove your existing brake components. Now, if you're doing the first brake upgrade on your truck, obviously you're going to have the stock stuff. I've got the Willwood stuff that I did a few years ago. So I'm going to be removing that, and I'll show you how to do that. So first let me get my wheel spacer off here. See, I've got extended studs as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a flathead screwdriver and a mallet, and I'm going to tap around this cap. That's going to allow me to take the cap off. Then there's going to be a cotter pin I've got to undo and pull out. Then there's going to be a nut that you undo, you take it off, and this entire assembly will slide off. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and remove this caliper. Now, the entire reason that this swap works without a bracket is because apparently God loves Tacomas as much as I do. So these Brembos actually line up to the holes on the spindle perfectly. The only thing that needs to be done in order to actually get them on is to trim these shrouds so that the caliper fits in the space, and to widen these bolt holes so that these bolts can go through them. But that reminds me, in the case of the CTSV caliper, it uses an M12 bolt, which is smaller in diameter than the M14 bolt that you need for the Cadillac ATS. So in my case, I don't have to drill the spindle at all. All I'll have to do is trim the shroud and I'm ready to roll as far as the caliper goes. Let's see if these shears will do the trick. Yep, a little butter. See if we've got enough room for a caliper now. Looks like we're squared away. Might just trim this a little bit here and there in the corner, just for extra clearance. Actually, kind of like that. Not even bad. Alright, like I said, now we're ready to mount our caliper. The only thing I need to do is mount the rotor to the hub. So looking at the rotor, the orientation that you mount the rotor is actually very important to the ventilation of the rotor working the way it's supposed to. So these slots are supposed to point toward the front of the vehicle. The reason being that they point the opposite direction from the vents in here, which are going that way. Air is supposed to enter through the center here and shoot out in that direction, and that's how you ventilate the rotors. So I'm going to make sure that I mount them in that orientation so that everything is flowing the way it's supposed to. So this one, because of that, will be the driver's side, and the other one will be the passenger side. Do take note of that. It is very important that you notice that these are sided, and you can't just put one wherever you want. So looking at my gyro disc rotor versus my old Willwood one, the first thing that becomes evident is that this is slightly larger in diameter. Not a substantial amount, but it is a little bit larger. The other key difference that you'll notice is it's a good bit thicker, right? So this is maybe 2/3 of the way as thick as this new rotor is. So that means more thermal mass for use on the racetrack, which is always a good thing. You'll also probably notice that the area for the pad here is a good bit thicker. That does mean more rotational inertia because there's more mass. However, that does mean more thermal mass, which is actually good for the racetrack. And, you know, greater area, you can have a bigger pad, so you can have better grip, you can have better heat transfer. It's all an advantage from a racetrack perspective. If your concern was mainly autocross, you would probably want to stay with that because you have less unsprung weight and less rotational inertia, obviously. But in my case, since I'd like to be able to hit the track and have that capability, this is what I need to go to. You'll probably notice that there are 2 sets of mounting holes drilled on my rotor for this side. That's an unfortunate side effect of me not leaving any lug nuts with the machinist. So when he started centering this about the hub, right, he did that on the lathe, then he mounted these onto the lug nuts on the hub and used that to mark these holes from the back. Unfortunately, because I didn't leave him any lug nuts, it was harder for him to center everything perfectly. So once I went over there and dropped off the lug nuts he requested, he was able to drill a second set of holes that are perfectly spot on to the hub. I figured someone in the comments would ask about that, so that's the reason for that. Now, because the hub is made out of steel and these are aluminum brake hats, I'm going to make sure and add a little bit of anti-seize in between. The reason just being so that I don't have any cross corrosion and the risk of this seizing onto it. I'm also going to put some onto the bolts, into the threaded holes. And the reason for that is just, again, I don't want those steel bolts to seize in the aluminum threads. And I'm going to have a deformed lock nut on the back end of this just to hold it, because I don't really trust threads in aluminum to hold my brakes to my hubs. So that's a very key detail that you should keep in mind. If you're going to do this and you're going to use the aluminum hats like I am, you want to make sure you go ahead and put a nut on the back side. And don't trust a nylon nut either in this application. You want to go ahead and get one of those deformed one-time use only nuts that stays on super tight. This stuff almost paints itself on. It sucks because when you get it where you don't want it, you can never get it off. Or you can, but it's an annoyance. So with the bolts all tightened down, I'm going to flip this around and put in the lock nuts on the back. Alright, so let's get this rotor back on. Alright, let's put the wheel bearing back in. Alright, it's nice and centered the way it should be. And there's the ring. Goes here. Right. Followed up by this nut. This nut goes back in hand tight. You're not supposed to tighten this down with a wrench. Alright, from the very first time I ever did rotors on this truck, that's how it was. That's how it should be. Don't do crazy stuff. Hand tight, that's it, call it a day. Put this retainer back on. And then you put in a cotter pin. Alright, put the cotter pin in. Then we're going to bend the cotter pin down. Using needle nose. First we want to line it well. And just bend it down. So that it can't back out. Using pliers. Okay, now we're going to put a little bit of grease around this face just so that it's nice and greased up, and then we'll knock the cap back on. I've got some high temp bearing grease here. Just gonna take this, the glob on my finger. I'm gonna roll it around here. Make sure everything is nicely greased up. Got some grease up there. Let's tap this back on. This part, you don't use the hammer itself. Use either a rubber mallet or the wood on the back of the hammer, the handle. Sure it's all nice and evenly seated. Then rub off any excess grease. Okay, now having done this, this is pretty dirty as far as the rotor surface goes. So we're going to go ahead and use a little bit of brake clean just to get the rotor cleaned up and ready for the pads. Go ahead and put in the cardboard here. Catch anything that drips off. Then I'm going to open the garage partially and turn on the fan so I can vent out the fumes, because this stuff does smell very strong. With the rotor in place, now it's time to go ahead and put on the caliper. Now, I've read that the caliper may not center exactly over the rotor when mounted to the Tacoma spindle, so you generally use washers for that. So I ordered these washers to do that with. Hopefully that will help me to get it perfectly centered the way that it needs to be. So let's take a look at that. So it seems I spoke a little bit too soon with regard to the fitment of this caliper. While it certainly does have the same size bolt hole, unlike the ATS V1, the problem is actually that the center to center distance between those holes and the mounting holes of this caliper are actually not the same. So it's very close, but not spot on, which is unusual because when I put these up against the ATS calipers, they seemed exactly the same. But right now, just having the bolts sticking out of here, if I try to line this, it won't go in the top. So I'm gonna have to bore out each hole ever so slightly in order to create enough give for me to be able to shift this over and be able to install it. It's not a major deal, but it is a bit of a buzzkill because I was expecting to not have to do any drilling. So as of right now, I've bored out my spindle to a 1/2 inch. That's still not large enough for my bolts from the CTSV caliper to line up. So I'm going to go up to a 17/32. Now I've actually ordered 2 different size drill bits. I've got a 17/32 and I've got a 35/64. Based on my calculations, 17/32 should do it, but in the off chance that I've made a slight mistake, 35/64 should get me there. The nice thing is that in the future, if I want to switch the ATS caliper, which does line up perfectly to the spindle, those use an M14 bolt. 14 millimeters is bigger than 35/64, so I'll just have to bore it out slightly larger one more time, and then I can put the ATS calipers in. But in the meantime, I've got the CTSV, so that's what I'm going to roll with. Let's go ahead, open up my new drill bit. I like how this comes wrapped. It's fancy. And it's greased up in some real sticky grease. Let's bore it out to that, shall we? Man, that almost doesn't fit inside my drill. Okay. Now, a major key to this is not to try to bore it out too large in one go. You want to go in between steps in order to make it easier. So like if I were, for example, starting with the stock M12 size hole and trying to go up to an M14, that would have been ridiculous. I've actually done it that way once on a friend's truck, and it was really difficult because he didn't buy in between size drill bits. This is still not super easy, but it's a lot easier than going from a small hole to a very large one. If you've got some old motor oil or something, or actual proper cutting fluid, you can dip your drill bit in that in between passes, and that'll help make this go faster and help your drill bit last longer. What a pain. Almost there. Let me get some coolant. Alright. Going to go ahead and dip this in some oil. Be nice if I had like a drill press that could mop this way. Time to turn on the industrial fan. Alright, let's drill the next one. There. Add a little more oil. Let's do this. the target. Here goes nothing. And we're right on target. Perfect. We can finally mount this caliper. Excited for this.